In this video, I will be going over the different exponent rules that you use when you are working in algebra with variables that have exponents. And the first one is we're going to call the product rule. So we have a variable such as x, say it's raised to the power, we'll call that m. And you're multiplying it times another x that is raised to a power, and we'll call that n. So we're really multiplying those two x's, those two x terms. But when I multiply the x to the m times the x to the n, I have to add their exponents, okay? So this is the formula right there. For when you're multiplying them, you end up writing the x just once, and you add the exponents. So that's going to be the formula for there, and I'll show you some examples in a minute. Then we have, we have the quotient rule. Now in this case, we have the x variable to the m on top. It's being divided by the x to the n on bottom. So when we have that, just like up before when we did the product rule, when we multiplied these x's, we added the exponents. Here, when we divide the x terms, we're going to subtract their exponents, and we're going to do it as m minus n, so the one on top minus the one in the denominator. Right there, x to the m minus n. Now, a third rule is what we call the power rule, and that is when I take, say, x to the m, and then instead of writing another x, I'm not dividing or multiplying it, I am actually raising that in the parentheses to another power. Okay, so it's x to a power or exponent called m, x to the m, in parentheses, raised to the n, right? So I have x to a power, and then I'm raising it even more. And that n, that's a power outside of the parentheses. Okay, so when we have this power rule, we have a variable and to an exponent inside the parentheses, and just the exponent outside the parentheses. It's the power rule, and in this case, we're going to multiply those exponents. So I would get x to the m times n. And as far as important facts, later on I'm going to go over some important things you have to deal with when I add numbers in front of the variables. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples of those rules in action. So, say for the product rule, remember I'm multiplying x to the some power times x to another power, and what did I do? I also want to point out that I can write this as the x cubed dot x5. We do use that a little bit, but what we end up doing is putting the x cubed and the x to the 5 in parentheses next to each other, and that means multiplication, okay? In case you didn't know, you want to get used to that. So this is the product rule because I'm multiplying those x terms. And remember, I will add the exponents, the 3 and the 5. I will get 8, and I will have x to the 8th power. That's how I do the product rule. Okay, here's another example where I have x in parentheses times x to the 3rd power. It's in parentheses. Again, I'm multiplying those to the x times the x cubed. Now here, it's really important, and when you go to add the exponents, some people might think when you look at that first x, oh, there's no exponent, so I don't add anything. It's like a 0 or something. So I would end up getting x to the 3rd. You got to make sure that you remember that x right there, the first x, is really to the first power. Anytime we just write x or y, whatever, we really mean to the first power. Okay? And you want to make sure you do that because now it changes what I'm doing. I have x to the first, so 1 plus 3. Okay, so I make sure I have that 1 plus the 3, and I get x to the 4th. Now let's take a look at the quotient rule, okay? So that's when we're dividing. So let's say we have something like x to the 7th divided by x to the 3rd. So we write the x, and then we just do 7 minus 3, which will be 4, so we get x to the 4th power. Let's take a look. We can take another example. I have x to the 5th over x to the 5th. Well, okay, I write the letter x once, and then I do the 5 on top exponent minus the 5 on the bottom. I'll get x to the 0, and anything to the 0 power, no matter what it is 1. So that turns out to be just 1. Now for the power rule. Let's see how that works. Okay, so we're doing something like x cubed raised to the 2nd power. That's what we call a power to a power. All right, remember in this case we will multiply the exponents, the 3 times the 2, and we'll get x to the 6th. So when you have the power rule, you multiply the exponents. Here's another one. I have x to the 5th to the 1/2. So it doesn't matter that I have a 1/2. I'm still going to multiply that 5 times 1/2. I get 5 times 1/2, which is x to the 5/2. And I would just leave it like that. So now I've come to the point where I've got some, I call it important details or whatever. It's something you have to deal with when you're working with these rules with the x variable, the y variable, whatever variable it is. The first one examples I gave you are pretty straightforward. What you're going to do is you're going to end up getting things called coefficients in front of your variables. And called coefficients are they're the numbers that are in front of the variables, like say here, 3x. The 3 is a coefficient. Even if I put x to the fourth, the 3 is still the coefficient of x, because it's really 3 times x to the fourth. Okay, so those are coefficients right there. And what we're going to do is our rules, we sort of have a little bit different rules of how to deal with the coefficients than we did when I had the exponent rules. But it's important to realize what they are. So let's say we have that 3x to the fourth, and we're going to multiply it times, say, a 2x, let's say, to the second power. Okay, it's parentheses, they're multiplied times each other. And I know I'm going to end up adding the exponents because it's the product rule. But I am not adding the 3 and 2 coefficient. Okay, I'm multiplying. I multiply the 3 that's in front of the x to the fourth times the 2 that's in front of the x squared. So I'm multiplying the coefficients. So I'll get 3 times 2. And then I'll compute that later as 6. Now I have the variable, and I, of course, add the exponents because it's a product rule. So I'm adding the 4 in the 2 because it's a product rule. So I'll have the 4 plus 2. I'm going to add them, and I'll get 3 to the 6th power. Okay, so 6 to the 6th power, 6x to the 6th power would be what I would get there. Okay, then dealing with coefficients, again, say in a quotient rule, let's say I have 9y to the 5th in the numerator on top, and I have divided by 12y in the denominator. Okay, so that is the quotient rule. Now, I know we went over, we have to subtract the exponent of the top y, subtract the exponent of the bottom y, which of course again is 1. But what do we do with the coefficients? Okay, the 9 is the coefficient of the y to the 5th, and 12 is the coefficient of the y. Well, we're actually going to do the division. That is the division, the 9 divided by 12. So I'm going to do 9 divided by 12, but in this case really I'm not going to do a decimal, I'm just going to do 9 divided by 12 simplifies to 3 over 4. So really what you're doing is you're kind of going back to when you simplified fractions that say it was like 9/12, and you would simplify it to 3 over 4. But we have the y to the 5th in the numerator, okay, and we're dividing it by y, and again, very important that I put that 1 above that y until you actually get used to that. Because, again, I subtract the exponent from the top variable, the 5, minus the 1 for the y in the denominator. So if I didn't put a 1 there, someone sometimes will think, oh, it's just y to the 5th on top, and there's no exponent on the bottom for that y, like 5 minus 0, it's 5. No, remember, it's a 1 there. When you don't write an exponent, it's a 1. So it's really 5 minus 1 for the y, and that means we're going to end up getting a, we can write this as, well, subtract the 5 minus 1, so of course that's going to be a 4. And I'll write the 3 over 4, and then I can write y to the 4th power. Okay, so that is a correct answer, but you also may write this as that 3, those numbers, the 3 over 4, the coefficients, you can actually write those out front like this. So you go 3 over 4, and then write the y to the 4th. Either one of those are acceptable, and sometimes one's better to use than the other, but it's good to know both. Okay, now when it comes to the power rule, this can get a little bit tricky with the coefficients. A lot of people can mess up on these, so they really get used to them. Alright, so here's an example of a power rule. In parentheses, I have 3x to the 3rd, and I'm going to raise that to the 2nd power. So it's a power rule, right? Because we know we have something inside of parentheses, a variable with an exponent, raised to another power. Okay, this x is only written once. There's not another x. I'm not multiplying, I'm not dividing, I am raising it to a power. So we know when we do that we're going to end up multiplying that exponent of 3 above the x times that 2 that's outside the parentheses. We know that's how we do the power rule. Okay, but we have to be very careful because that coefficient, that 3 inside the parentheses, that is affected by the exponent of 2 because the 3 is in the parentheses, right? So it is affected by squaring the parentheses or raising the parentheses to the 2nd power. But you have to be careful because a lot of times people will want to, when they're learning the power rule, they want to just take that 3 that's in front, the coefficient, and also multiply that times the power of 2. You know, because we're getting used to multiplying, like the exponent of 3 times a 2, we get the 3 times 2. But then when it comes to dealing with that 3 in front, we do not multiply the 3 in front, the coefficient, times the power outside. No, what we do is we'll actually raise, okay, we're kind of writing it out the long way here to kind of see it. If you wrote it out squared, you could see that you would multiply it out. But the point is that in that parentheses, in the blue parentheses where it's 3 in parentheses, x cubed, raised to the second power, I'm taking that 3, the coefficient of 3, and I am raising it to the second power. Okay, the 3 goes to the second power. It gets squared. So 3 squared is 9. And then I know that for the variables, we're multiplying. Look this way, we're getting 9x to the 6th. So that's really how you do that. You're going to raise the coefficient inside to whatever power is outside. All right? And so it's very important to keep those in mind when we're doing those. Those can be really tricky. That we got to be careful when you get the coefficients that you're actually doing the rules that apply to the coefficients, which are never the same as whatever variable and exponent you are working with. And again, as I said, that last one there, that can be really tricky where you've got the coefficient inside of a parentheses, and you have to remember that when you raise that parentheses to a power, it's still affecting the coefficient, but differently than how it affects the exponent. So as you practice these, you get better and better, because then when they start mixing them in a couple of the rules in one problem, you'll be able to keep track of that technique or the correct formula.